where they say there is a growing anger actually at Putin for not taking the gloves off and for not winning this before. And apparently there's a lot of pressure on Putin, both from some of the troops as well as some of the higher level folks. What can you tell us about that?
Well, look, there's always going to be frustration at any time. I mean, you were in the military. You know that even when you're winning, the PFC is going to be bitching about something.
Fair enough.
And so there's always going to be it. Plus, in Russia today, people say there's no freedom of speech in Russia, but there is to a very extensive degree. There's a class of people, the military bloggers, who have made a living off of exploiting the negative side of Russian society. Russia has a negative side, just like we do. There's always people that want the government to do more, do better. And there's the armchair, quarterbacks, an entire, cadre of military bloggers who haven't served relevantly, don't know anything about what they're writing about, but they speak emotionally about this war. These are the same people that supported Prigozhin against, in Wagner's march on Moscow, thinking that was a good idea. It wasn't a good idea. It was treason. And these people also, they tend to get very focused on the battlefield and they forget the bigger picture. They forget that, Russia was subjected to stringent sanctions by the collective West that were designed to break Russia's economy. Look at the Russian economy today. It's not broken. Russia is thriving. Yes, the sanctions are starting to pinch, but they didn't bring about the collapse. Why? Because of the policies of Vladimir Putin. They also forget that Russia didn't go to war against Ukraine. Russia started a special military operation of a very limited, scope and scale, designed not to occupy Kiev or defeat Kiev, but to compel Ukraine to the negotiating table. Less than a week after the SMO started, Ukraine went to the negotiating table. A month later, they had a finalized peace deal, the Istanbul Communique, that Ukraine was ready to sign, but it was the United States and Great Britain that pulled the plug on that to extend the conflict. Russia had to adapt to that. But, people are like, why didn't Russia mobilize sooner? How? With what? You're saying you should have mobilized what, in April 2022? Are you smart enough to tell me what the Russian economy was going to do, how it would react to the mobilization of 300,000 men? The answer is nobody knows how that. Vladimir Putin certainly didn't know that. He was still being advised by his economic advisors that the sanctions could result in a 20% constriction of the Russian economy. And how do you adapt to that? So he had to play it patient. It wasn't until the United States injected $50 billion, NATO retrained and rebuilt a Ukrainian army, injected tens of thousands of mercenaries, and they launched a surprise attack against the Russian military that was already beginning to withdraw per the peace agreement. People forget that. Russia had a good faith measure. Vladimir Putin just admitted something. Emmanuel Macron called him up and said, you can't expect Ukraine to sign the deal. Meaning Macron, the French president, said, Ukraine's ready to sign this deal, but they won't sign it with a pistol to their head. And Putin said, okay, we'll withdraw the troops from Kiev. We'll withdraw the troops from Sumy, from Chernihiv. We'll start withdrawing the troops from Kharkov. And then France and everybody else stabbed Russia in the back yet again, and did that attack in the fall that recaptured those territories. Russia had to adapt to that. That's when they did the mobilization. But at that time, the economy had stabilized. We're only looking at a 2 to 4% constriction, and later it turned into growth. That's the genius of Vladimir Putin that all of these naysayers don't talk about. They don't talk about how he preserved the Russian economy. They don't talk about how he preserved Russia's position diplomatically around the world. If Russia had gone in hard, the Chinese may not be supporting Russia today. Iran may not be aligned with Russia today. Vladimir Putin has behaved in a very pragmatic, responsible manner that has managed this situation, and it's managed it very effectively. Maybe not to the bloodlust of those who don't fight, and yet they want to close with and destroy the enemy using other people. The Russian casualty figures are low compared to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians right now have changed the paradigm. They are exclusively recruiting and training drone operators. So the war has become a very drone-centric war. And this has required some adaptation on the part of the Russians. But the Russians are prevailing. The notion that Marco Rubio says that the Russians are losing 50 to 20,000 soldiers a month is absolute bollocks. Nothing true about that, not even close to that. But the Russians are suffering casualties. Vietnam, we suffered 200, dead a week, and that was horrible for us. It broke our country. The Russians are suffering maybe 100 plus dead a day. It is a very bloody war. This is intensive combat. And this is where some people say we have to stop this. We have to stop shedding blood. We have the ability to transform this conflict, but to what end? Because those people don't talk about the consequences of a war with Europe. They don't talk about what happens if you provoke Europe into putting boots on the ground. Now you have an expanded conflict, more Russians die. Putin has been working to eliminate that possibility, but Europe has now made it impossible. And now you finally have the Russian government recognizing not what was known in the past, because in the past Russia was managing this problem, but today you have Europe having crossed the line. They have created a safe haven where drones can be produced without Russian interdiction. These drones, together with intelligence, are provided to the Ukrainians to strike Russia's strategic depth, and they're starting to have an impact on Russia's economy. And this is an unsustainable thing. And so now you have a lot of bloggers, military bloggers, and people saying, we were right. We were right. Well, a broken clock's right twice a month or twice a day, sometimes twice a month, depending on the slow part of the clock. But the point is that okay, so they're right now that there has to be a change. But the time for this change wasn't a year ago or 2 years ago when they were crowing, because Putin was managing the problem effectively. The time for change is now because the situation has changed, and the Russians simply cannot allow Europe, to articulate preparations for war. Please never forget that. Europe is right now articulating preparations for war. We would not tolerate this as Americans. Absolutely not. If China was sitting there saying we are preparing for a war with the United States in 2030, and we see active preparation, we wouldn't sit back and go, well, don't worry about it. We'd say, no, you want a war? Let's do it now. Let's accelerate this process, because now we have the advantages. We're not going to wait for you to accrue advantages against us. We know this is the case. Europe is openly articulating and advocating for war against Russia 2029, 2030. And then you have, again, the nuclearization of the European military dynamic, which is unacceptable to Russia. You have Germany talking about the acquisition of nuclear weapons. Basically, Russia has decided that this is literally not going to continue. It's not a sustainable policy direction on the part of Europe.
Right.
Russia's,
and that's why I wanted to get back to the second thing that Karaganov said there. He said that we should, and he said, I have advised the government that we should strike with conventional weapons at several locations. And I'm told from some others who claim to know that it's like military concerns or military factories, whether it's drones, missile components, rocket engines, et cetera, at locations inside of Europe. And of course, that carries an almost immediate Article 5 initiations, which could have all kinds of ramifications. But the fact that he immediately then went to, and then will escalate up to nuclear strike, if that doesn't deter them, I mean, that seems like, you call this the fallacy. I think it's a definite risky situation to think that they can hit NATO countries, which have not been hit in anything so far, and then be ready to go right to nuclear weapons after that. Do you think Putin would be ready to do that if he strikes with conventional weapons?
I think Vladimir Putin has worked with General Gerasimov and other Russian military and national security people to devise a nuclear posture that is premised on no first use of nuclear weapons. And I think that the thinking that led to that applies today. That's why I call it the Karaganov fallacy. I don't think Russia gains anything from using nuclear weapons first. As I said, even if you don't trigger an immediate nuclear response, you've created a precedent that has to be acted on, and it will eventually lead to a general escalation and the world ends. Nuclear weapons can never be used. But Russia's nuclear arsenal is an effective deterrent against any effort on the part of Europe or the United States to counter the Russian conventional strike with nuclear weapons. But we also have to remember this. Article 5 is not an automatic. I mean, people who have read Article 5 of the NATO Charter understand that it calls for consultations and decisions will be made about what actions, if any, will be taken. A Russian strike against Europe is not a strike against NATO at this juncture. It's a strike against active participants in the Ukraine conflict. And therein lies the rub. Because Germany is taking actions inside Ukraine against Russia outside the framework of NATO. So is Great Britain, and so are other nations. NATO hasn't built these factories. Germany has built these factories. The United Kingdom has built these factories. These factories don't fall under the umbrella of Article 5 protections because these are nations engaged in armed conflicts. They are engaged in armed conflicts. That is the law of war. They are engaged in an armed conflict against Russia. So for Russia to retaliate in kind, doesn't trigger Article 5. And at a minimum, you would have many nations in NATO saying, no, Germany, you brought this on yourself. You didn't come to us and ask us for a united position on this. We didn't support this. Therefore, we're not going to support you. And the United States will be first and foremost among them. We are not going to go
so let me ask you on that question. I think it's pretty clear that with the U.S. attack against Iran in 2025, with the seizure of a head of state of Venezuela, with a complete violation of any law that exists anywhere, we could care less about the law. So if we say, oh, Article 5 applies because we decided, even though our own laws and the articles itself said if you're attacked, not if somebody responds to your attack. So, right. But that doesn't matter. But the question is, it seems like and I'm talking conventional here, it seems like a pretty big risk for Russia to take to say, hey, we're going to hit some of these concerns, so you're going to finally feel the pain of what you've been doing to our troops over here. On the one hand, you can certainly argue that that's take your nationality out of it. That's just rational that a side would do that and not forever let the other side with impunity keep on killing your soldiers in a proxy conflict there. But there's obviously big risk to it. How do you see those risks being managed? And meaning that if they don't go with the fallacy that they would never do that, how do you see it playing out?
Well, first of all, I believe that Russia has had understood that there was a price to pay to keep this war limited to Ukrainian soil. They've engaged in a war of attrition that goes beyond simply the Ukrainian military, but it now factors in how to wear down the defense industrial potential of the collective West. And Russia has successfully done this.